We'd like to begin by acknowledging our presence on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Tongva and Kizh Nation peoples and their neighbors from north to south, the Chumash, Tataviam, Katanamuk, Serrano, Kalia, Peamkuicham, Ahashaman, Ipai Tipai, Kumeyaay, and the Quechan peoples, whose ancestors ruled the region that we now call Southern California for at least 9,000 years. Indigenous stewardship and rightful claims to these lands have never been voluntarily relinquished nor legally extinguished. We pay respects to the members and the elders of these communities, past and present, who remain caretakers and advocates of these lands, river systems, and the waters and islands of the Santa Barbara Channel. For a more detailed land acknowledgement authored by the USC Van Hunnick History Department, we invite you to visit their website. We'd love to know where you're watching from if you're joining us on Zoom, so feel free to let us know in the chat. And if you would like to know what Indigenous territory you're on, my colleague Maya will be posting a link where you can explore that history of the land you're on. My name is Martha Stroud, and I'm the Associate Director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research. And it's my true pleasure to welcome you to today's event, which is the last academic lecture of the spring semester. And it also falls on a momentous day, since 9 years ago today, the center was founded here at USC. So happy birthday to the center. Just a couple of protocols for our people on Zoom, who are watching on Zoom. First of all, right now you're viewing a side-by-side view of the slides and the speaker, and I just want to bring to your awareness that you can make either window larger or smaller by dragging the line in between these two windows. So keep that in mind as our speaker today is sharing images. And we will have time for questions and discussion following the lecture. We invite and encourage questions, of course, of everybody in the room, but also those of you watching on Zoom using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom window. So now to introduce today's speaker, it's my pleasure to introduce the founding director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research, Chappell Guerin Chair in Jewish History, and Professor of History at USC, Wolf Grunner.
Thank you, Marta, and also Maya and Yamur for preparing the lecture. And I welcome our speaker in a second. Just a few remarks about the Center for Advanced Genocide Research, which, as already mentioned, celebrates the 9th anniversary now. And since its founding, we have concentrated our efforts on developing innovative and interdisciplinary research, focusing on 3 distinct areas. One is resistance to genocide and mass violence. One is violence, emotions, and behavioral change. And the last one is digital genocide studies. The center organizes a vibrant academic program each year, holding international conferences, hosting numerous fellows and increasingly visiting scholars as Dorota, and organizing workshops, lecture series, and other unique research, providing other unique research opportunities. But now it's my distinct pleasure to welcome a good friend, Dorota Glowacka. She is Professor of Humanities at the Universities of King's College in Halifax, Canada. She has taught critical theory, Holocaust and genocide studies, and the theories of gender and race in contemporary studies program since 1995, and is currently the director of this contemporary studies program. She also lectures as a kind of connecting university, Dalhousie University, and there she has cross appointments in the faculties of English, gender, women's studies, European studies, and interdisciplinary studies. That's a long list. So she works like crazy, I have to say. She received her PhD and her MA in comparative literature from the State University of New York at Buffalo, and her MA with distinction in English from the University of Wrocław in Poland. She's the author of several books, and one, I don't want to butcher the Polish title, is in English on the other side, Testimonies Affect Imagination, which was published in Warsaw in 2017. She also published Disappearing Traces, Holocaust Testimonies, Ethics and Aesthetics, Washington University Press, 2012. And Between Ethics and Aesthetics, Crossing the Boundaries, SUNY Press, 2002. She is the co-editor of Imaginary Neighbors, Mediating Polish-Jewish Relations After the Holocaust, which was published in 2007 with Nebraska University Press. And I'm really excited about some upcoming work from her. She is currently co-editing a special issue for the Journal of Holocaust Research with Regina Mühlhauser on sexuality and the Holocaust. She published numerous book chapters and articles, and I only want to mention two of them, which I think are very important of kind of illustrating her more recent work, which was one, Gender and the Shoah, Relational Imagination and the Cul-de-sacs of Remembrance in the volume Lessons and Legacies in 2017. And then more recently, the article, which is already widely cited and perceived as a standard in the new field, which is called Sexual Violence Against Men and Boys During the Holocaust, the Genealogy of Not So Silent Silence, which was published with the Journal of German History in 2021. She serves as the member of the academic committee at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum since 2017, and is a member of the editorial board of Holocaust Studies, the Journal of Culture and History, since 2013. Very important here to mention is her connection to the center, because she was the co-organizer, one of the co-organizers of our last year's conference, Mass Violence and Its Lasting Impact on Indigenous Peoples, in the case of the Americas and Australia and the Pacific regions, which you can actually, by the way, all the presentations and also Dorota see on our YouTube channel of the center. Just kind of go to YouTube and put in the Center for Advanced Genocide Research. She is currently, which is kind of in a way, preceding our conference, but also kind of lasting longer than our conference, working on as a primary investigator for a big grant of the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, which comes to fruition just soon with a week-long workshop next month in Washington, D.C., which is kind of entitled Trauma, Memory, Material Culture, a dialogue between the National Museum of the American Indian and the United States Holocaust Museum. So this is again showing kind of the kind of work she is doing, which crosses all boundaries. It's interdisciplinary, transnational, and intercultural. And I think it will be a really meaningful conversation of these two very different experiences, but also very similar experiences. Currently, she is working on a project on the politics of translating Polish Holocaust memoirs into English for a collaborative volume of Cambridge Handbook of Holocaust Literature. So this is a long list, and this is just a tiny bit of what she actually does. And so I'm really admiring her for how much she is able to do with a big teaching load at a small university very far up north in Canada. Okay. So without further ado, welcome her with a warm hand and for her lecture, Reframing Gender, Representations of Women's Bodies in Holocaust Photographs. Dorota,
Thank you very much for this generous and warm introduction. I'd like to express my gratitude to Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Studies for having me here as visiting professor for the month of April, and especially to the center's director, Wolf Gruner, and the center's associate director, Martha Stroud. I have really benefited from my stay here, professionally, of course, but also personally. Really thank you for your hospitality and your friendship, and now it's on record. I want everyone to know. I would also like to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking today on the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territory of Gabrielino Tongva people and the neighbors. The university where I am from sits on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, who have been stewards of that land for 10,000 years. The land is covered by peace and friendship treaties. As you can see in my signature here, it is now customary to refer to Halifax by its Mi'kmaq name, Achebaktak, which means Great Harbor. So again, I'm delighted to be here, and I will be talking about representations of women's bodies in Holocaust photographs, and I'd like you to please note the content warning in the corner. I will be showing images that will be distressing and perhaps triggering and perhaps offensive. So please mind how you feel about them, and I would not want to harm anyone. If you need to step out, please do so. I would like to share these images respectfully and compassionately, and my aim is to pay tribute to the women in these photographs, to honor the memory, and to remember them in the way that honors the memory. And what I'd like to show today is that the depictions of female bodies in Holocaust photographs, and especially those that have become iconic, were shaped by traditional conceptions of gender and sexuality. And that goes for men's bodies as well, but that would have to be a topic of another lecture. And these photographs were taken in extreme circumstances, in the camps, in the ghettos, in the killing fields. During mass executions, some of them. Another genre of Holocaust photographs would be liberators' photographs. I'll be showing one of them. So to me, it is astonishing that within such like a unique and traumatic visual repertoire, these women's bodies are represented, I believe, and I hope to show that, in ways that conform to traditional gendered tropes. And moreover, these gendered conventions have also influenced the way how these photographs have circulated in the post-memorial landscape, how they have been exhibited in museums and in memorial publications and shared in the classrooms and so forth and so forth. While at the same time, of course, tacitly controlling which images have therefore been excluded from these post-memorial practices and practices of memorialization. So I'm going to show two sets of photographs which are from Auschwitz, but I will also reference some very well-known, you probably recognize the image, photographs from the mass executions of the Jews of Liepāja on December 15, 1942, in the nearby dunes of Skede, which was on the Baltic Sea. So I will begin with that. I will quote from Holocaust scholar Mariana Hirsch, who wrote about this photograph, I quote, "Displayed in their full vulnerability and humiliation, they are doubly exposed in their nakedness and their powerlessness. They are shot before being shot." So Hirsch draws attention to the violence that's inherent in the very act of photographing. And I would add that this violence is also sexualized violence, because these women were humiliated specifically as women. So what you see in this photograph are 4 women kind of lined up to face the camera. And whether it was intended by the photographer or not, this kind of effect, unforgettable effect of this photograph is enhanced by a very symmetrical composition, as you can see. Like the women's linked arms form this horizontal line, and then it's intersected in the middle by the figure of an older woman, and then what appears to be perhaps a flirtation gesture of the woman on this side, most likely coerced, okay, is complemented with the posture of the girl on the other side. The girl is standing sort of slightly to the back, and her body is pressed. What we now know is her mother. So in Western iconography, the figure of the child is often emblematic of innocence. But in this picture, the fact that this girl is fully dressed with a bonnet only emphasizes the women's state of undress. So to me, this photograph is a horrific evidence of gendered relations of power inherent in the ways we look. And I will not be theorizing too much, but I just make one reference to French theorist Michel Foucault, who writes that the effects of power and forms of control that operate on bodies are disseminated through visual regimes. Or to put it differently, our acts of looking are not natural, but they are kind of determined, or they are socially constructed, and they regulate these acts of looking, regulate the intelligibility and the agency of bodies that we look at. So what I'm hoping to do in my work, among others, is to find ways in which these accustomed ways of looking can be interrupted and changed, so that we can look at the women in these photographs with compassion and with a gaze that is different than through the lens of the perpetrator's camera. And so that we can look at those photographs in such a way that we can give them back the dignity and the humanity and their own unique female bodies. So I find this juxtaposition of this aesthetic effect and horror in this photograph really unsettling. So I want to show you another photograph that perhaps will evoke a kind of similar dissonance, so to speak. And this photograph will show a dead female prisoner lying in the snow in Auschwitz-Birkenau shortly after the liberation. I'm showing, this photograph in this manner because I did not encounter it in a Holocaust museum. I'm sorry, thank you.
It takes a minute, Dorota, once you advance. So just
Okay. Okay. I did not encounter it in a Holocaust museum. I saw it on the inside cover of a book of poems by a Polish poet, Tadeusz Różewicz. And this book was written, one of really foremost Polish poets. The book was written as a tribute to the poet's friend, who was an art historian and was also an inmate and a survivor of Gross-Rosen and Sachsenhausen concentration camps. And shortly after this book was published, I interviewed Tadeusz Różewicz because I was asked to write an entry about his work for the Holocaust Encyclopedia of Holocaust Literature. So during the interview, I asked him, well, why did you put the image of a dead woman on the inside cover of your book, even though it has nothing to do with your friend and his experiences? And Różewicz answered that he had seen this photograph in an album of photographs shortly after the war, and it had haunted it ever since. And he said it had haunted him because, he says, ta kobieta jest taka piękna, which means this woman is so beautiful. And I found that really distressing because I thought that he had appropriated a document, a visual document of this woman's horrific death to pay an homage to his friend who was a professor of art history. And undoubtedly, and I'm not the only person to say that, I read a work by some Polish scholars, and we all point out that this image conforms to a kind of aesthetic trope or iconography of female nudes. So in turn, Różewicz was really displeased with me because I included a reference to his mother's Jewish roots in the encyclopedia entry, and he asked me to remove it. But but I will return to that later. So I was haunted by that photograph in my turn, and a few years ago, in 2017, I started looking for this photograph, and I found it reprinted in several Polish Holocaust memorial publications. And the photograph is one of a set of 32 pictures that were taken by a Polish photographer, Henryk Makarewicz, shortly after the liberation of the camp. And before the war, Makarewicz was already a well-known photographer and artist. So, you know, he was not an amateur. He knew what he was doing. And in 1944, Makarewicz was recruited for the film crew of the Polish Berlin Army, which later accompanied the Red Army during the liberation of Auschwitz. And the Red Army reached Auschwitz-Birkenau on January 27, 1945 at around 3 p.m. And Makarewicz was instructed to film sections of the camp, including ruins of the crematoria, so-called Canada barracks, in which the victims' possessions were stored, and that was for the Soviet Commission investigating Nazi crimes. That was the purpose of the documentation. So now we know that Canada barracks were set on fire on January 23 by the fleeing German guards. They burned for 5 days and nights. And since one of Makarewicz's images shows the burning barracks, I kind of infer that the pictures must have been taken on January 28th. I would just quickly note that there are not very many images or kind of visual documentation from the liberation of the camps in the East when you compare it to the documentation from the camps liberated by the British and American armies, such as Buchenwald or Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, and so forth. The first footage from the liberation of the camps, that was during the liberation of Majdanek, July 23, 1944, by the Soviet army. And there were some images, but they were not widely circulated in Western media. I can say more about that later, but and also compared to the soldiers of Western armies, you know, Soviet and Polish soldiers did not routinely carry a camera in the knapsacks. And then the images were also of poor quality. Even the cameramen that accompanied the Red Army had trouble accessing photographic materials, and they didn't have, you know, lamps and so forth. So the iconic images of the liberation of Auschwitz that we are familiar with, let me see if I have that. We may be familiar, sort of children sort of showing the tattoos and the inmates sort of greeting the Soviet army, and some shots of the inmates. They are all from the Soviet Chronicle. Okay? Most of them are. Some of them, and they were documented, the film was documented over the period of several months. So many of these images are kind of post factum, and some of the locals were actually asked to kind of act as extras and so forth. And so I compared the Soviet Chronicle with Makarewicz's photographs. One thing I noticed is that there is no snow in the Soviet Chronicle, and there is plenty of snow in Makarewicz's photographs. And in 1944, the snow in Auschwitz-Birkenau started melting on January 29. So I am going to focus on 4 images from Makarewicz's series because they coalesce into a visual narrative, which I will now show with you. So this is the first one with the caption, "The general view taken from the watchtower of the main gate." And I'm sort of drawing attention to the photographer's original captions. Of course, they were in Polish, so the original captions translated into English. But if you go on the website of the Holocaust Museum, you will see different captions that were sort of appended later. And sometimes I will mention both captions. So here we see these rows of barracks on the left against this snowy expanse that's the main camp road. And this is the second photograph. So you can see that the camera sort of moved away from the camp entrance and it gets closer to the ground. It begins to reveal bodies of prisoners, partly dead prisoners, partly covered in snow, and the original caption read, "The trail of evacuation marked by bodies every few steps. Those who fell were killed on the spot." And this is the third in the series. This image indicates that the photographer had moved closer to the bodies lying on the ground. The walls of the barracks are now visible, partly visible, and the caption on the museum's website reads, "The corpses of prisoners lie in the snow outside a barracks in Auschwitz-Birkenau immediately after the liberation." Makarevich's original caption read, "Some more leftovers." So what you see here in the foreground is a woman in a short-sleeved dress lying face down in the snow among a pile of items of clothing. And further down to the right, we see a naked body of another woman with one leg slightly bent at the knee. So this is the last photograph in the series, and that's the one that the poet Różewicz was so drawn to. So you see a close-up of the woman that you see in the previous photograph, and she is naked except a short cardigan that covers part of her torso, and it's dark. The cardigan is dark, which kind of contrasts with the whiteness of the snow. And the caption, the museum's caption reads, "The corpse of a female prisoner lies in the snow outside a barracks in Auschwitz-Birkenau immediately after the liberation." So only now when you compare it with what I found in the book cover, I realized that the version that was reproduced by the poet was cropped, so you couldn't really tell, what the wooden structure was. And you couldn't tell it was a barracks, so it really camouflaged the photograph's location and kind of universalized the message. And now I also note that Różewicz's version of the photo was colorized to look like a sepia photograph. So again, it was more of a kind of artistic portrait in that sense. So here the woman's face is turned upward, slightly toward the camera, and her eyes appear to be open and kind of gazing upwards, so which creates the illusion that she's alive. And this effect is enhanced by the placement of her hands, one hand resting on her stomach and the other on her chest, exposing her right breast. I'm sorry, I get really distressed when I speak about this photograph, so please bear with me. And I don't do that very often. So in the center of the photograph, exactly in the center, is her pubic area. And and her legs are slightly apart, and perpendicular is this dark crevice of the barracks door. Again, a very symmetrical composition. And here you cannot see any other bodies that you see in this one. So the photographer must have positioned the camera in such a way as to obscure the bodies, or perhaps even moved the bodies. We now know that happened. So the original caption, the photographer's caption, was, "One of the bodies that did not reach the ovens, the crematorium was blown up on the day preceding evacuation." And I find that caption jarring, because this peacefully reposing woman does not seem to belong in this landscape of horror, death, devastation. So, I just add, and I'm sure many of you know it, that the peacefulness of this composition stands in stark contrast to the conditions of the camp that the liberators found when they arrived. They encountered about 7,000 emaciated prisoners that were either unable to move or they were wandering through the camp, foraging for food and clothing. There were an estimated 600 dead bodies strewn in every corner of Auschwitz camp complex. And then adding to the chaos, the camp was being plundered by the Soviet soldiers and also by the inhabitants, Polish inhabitants of the town of Oświęcim, who had just started coming back. They had been displaced, now they are coming back and they forage for wood and so forth. But the composition of Makarewicz's photograph as if lifts the woman's body from its horrific surroundings, erases the reality, the horrific reality of the camp. So like even the barracks in which she's lying, are kind of secluded from the locale. And it could be the door of any shed anywhere in Eastern Europe. So nothing about this image indicates that this is a terrifying circumstance. The woman is beautiful. She's frozen in time. There is nothing that leads us to believe that soon she will be buried anonymously in one of the mass graves. And as witnesses reported, the sight of dead bodies on the day of the liberation, that sight was revolting. And rather than, so the witnesses express disgust and revulsion rather than, pity and sorrow for what they saw. They are also like stunned at the sight. And in the standard liberation images, you see corpses arranged in piles and thrown into pits or scattered. And I'm sure you are familiar with these images, and I won't be showing them. Very often, when you look at those piles of corpses, they are lacking any unique markers of age or gender or nationality and so forth. But this image of this unblemished female body in the photograph appears untouched by all that, by starvation, by all the hardships of the camps. So it is incongruous with the familiar pictures that we know upon the liberation of the camps of the inmates, like their skeletal remains. They are different from other images of the images of survivors, whose appearance is sometimes indistinguishable from that of the dead, like the victims of medical experiments. They often appear, and sick women in women's barracks and so forth. They are starved, they are disfigured. And again, you may be familiar with these images, but I won't be sharing them. So according to Polish scholar Marta Zawodna, when the liberators were confronted with this incomprehensible spectacle of the devastation, they immediately set themselves to the task of restoring order. Okay? And as Zawodna says, the most important mechanism for doing that is separating the living from the dead. And the culminating moment of cleaning up the camp was the burial of the remains in 3 mass graves on February 28, 1945. And one of those 3 graves was designated for the bodies that were collected in Auschwitz-Birkenau. So it is very likely this is where the woman from Różewicz's photograph was buried. And this ritual of the funeral, you can say it served to resacralize those anonymous remains that prior to the burial had the status of, as you saw in the caption, leftovers that just needed to be cleared out. But in Makarewicz's photograph, if you remember, the reality of the realms of the living and the dead are confounded. The camera's gesture of blurring the line between the dead and the living, which it was supposed to demarcate, it's a transgressive gesture. Although you could also make the argument that because the photographer singles out the woman with his camera, perhaps the act of photographing reenacts a kind of symbolic burial. It really depends on how you wish to interpret. So considering, and it's, it's a little difficult, but considering that this photograph was taken by a member of the Liberating Army, it was really disconcerting to me that the image reminded me, Makarevich's image sort of reminded me, or rather I was reminded of Makarevich's image when I was reading an essay by a German scholar, Elisa Mainlander, entitled Making Sense of a Rape Photograph, Sexual Violence as Social Performance on the Eastern Front. And I will not share that image, but you can look it up in this excellent essay. And Mainlander examines a very disturbing photograph of a group of German soldiers in an unknown location in Eastern Europe. And the soldiers are clearly amusing themselves with the spectacle of one of the comrades pretending to engage in a sexual act with a local woman. And it is really astonishing how similar the woman in the photograph is in those two photographs. You cannot determine in either photograph, I mean, we know that the woman in the Auschwitz photograph is no longer alive, but again, there is this kind of blurring of the living and the dead in the rape photograph. You do not know in the rape photograph whether she is alive and was coerced into this horrific performance, or whether it's her remains, whether she's dead and her remains are horridly desecrated. And what really struck me is the similarity of the posture. It's like the exact same posture, kind of supine with like legs slightly, ajar and one leg bent at the knee. And also the hands are positioned in a similar way, one on the stomach, the other one on the chest. In Western iconography, and I know one of you works on Holocaust art, but in Western iconography, in many European paintings or by great masters, this pose is distinctly recognizable as a signifier of female eroticism and sexual submission. I'm just giving you a few. If you Google female nudes, this will what will come up, especially in photography. Okay? And I know that this is incredibly upsetting and offensive. It is offensive to my sense of even good taste and the memory of the dead. But I think it's important to show how these aesthetic conventions permeate the photographs that are documents of like horrific events. So Elisa Mainlander refers to this mock depiction of rape in the photograph from the Eastern Front as a trophy photograph. And there are many photographs from Nazi-occupied East that kind of serve to shore up the German colonizers' imperial power and virility, and that power was epitomized in this sexualized image of a woman who had been hunted by the soldiers and possessed. So of course the context and intention of the Auschwitz photograph is very different. In the rape photograph, the woman is put on display as a kind of object of mockery. But the woman in Makarevich's image is solemnly beautiful. She is Eurydice, arrested on the threshold of death, and her unseeing gaze conjures desire. Although her pose alludes to sexual submission, this peaceful, sorrowful ambience keeps at bay the odium of necrophilia that was so titillating in the rape photograph. Yet, I believe that Makarevich's photograph can also be thought of as a trophy photograph. Because it really recreates, and that's why I wanted to show the narrative sequence, it kind of recreates a kind of dynamic of hunting. Okay? The female body he picked out the female body from, all these frozen bodies that were lying around. And the camera is kind of prowling closer and closer to that body and circling it. So that the woman's single item of clothing highlights her nakedness. It's almost as if the camera was undressing her before our eyes. So This really is a perfect capture. So despite, I think, an immensely transgressive nature of that photograph and its kind of sexualized ambiance, the fact that it aestheticizes the reality of the camp, this photograph, at least in Poland, has been taken up in a number of memorial publications. So in Poland, you can encounter it quite often, especially in flagship publications of the State Museum of Auschwitz-Birkenau. And I saw it in Teresa Świebocka's photo album, which is a really well-researched photographic account of the camp. And this photograph is the centerfold of the album. Okay? So it's like the central image is Makarewicz's photograph. And then it is juxtaposed with another photograph, but only a cropped part of that photograph. I don't know how to use the pointer on your computer, Martha, so I just have to ask you to please kind of see the cropped part of the photograph, and that's the centerfold of that album. And this is also a picture by Makarewicz, which shows bodies of prisoners likely killed prior to the evacuation, and they are kind of spilling through the door of one of the barracks. And the scene also seems to be carefully composed. The original caption, Makarewicz's, read, "A store of human fuel handily by the ovens. The shed was full of bodies piled up to the ceiling. When the doors were opened, some cadavers tumbled out." And the figure in the foreground seems to be a child, curled up in a fetal position, with the kind of dark blanket enveloping the child's body. And then there is a woman lying on her stomach, her face sort of as if leaning toward the child, her facial features sculptured by frost, one breast prominently visible. And this image, I think, distinctly evokes a mother-child iconography, which again is very prominent in Holocaust photography. And I don't think it's a coincidence that this particular image was also captured in the Soviet documentary film, the same Chronicle. And when I was watching it, like the camera sort of panned over this image for a very long few seconds. Let me just, if I can juxtapose them, I'm sorry, I'm fully aware of how difficult to watch these images are. So this one is from the Soviet Chronicle. This is Makarewicz's photograph. You can see by the time the film was taken, the snow has melted, revealing the woman's facial features, but the child's body must have been turned 180 degrees. And it's quite likely to sort of enhance this kind of mother-child iconography. But the cropped, if you remember the cropped fragment of Makarewicz's photograph that was included in Świebocka's album does not show the child. So in that way, the two images of naked women sort of resonate, right, in this centerfold. I will just pass that on. And I just want to, once again, draw attention to this aesthetic trope of the beautiful cadaver. Okay? Let me just quote from American writer Susan Sontag, who was wondering why we are so drawn to images of mass atrocities, and she said, the images of the repulsive can also allure. It's in her well-known book on photography in 1970. But the woman in Makarewicz's photograph is not repulsive. On the contrary, she allures, she's alluring because her beauty is so unblemished. If you recall, the scene is also symmetrically arranged and so forth. And because the framing of the shot eliminates this gruesome reality of the camp, the photograph as if works to sort of recompose this decomposed locale. But then it fades as the evidence of the Nazi crimes, which it was supposed to take. And as if this sight of the woman's body lying in the snow sort of interrupted the photographer and sort of seducing him into his artistic vocation rather than documenting the camps. And the topos of the beautiful woman, very pronounced in Western iconography, but it is not very common in liberation photographs, with some exceptions that some of you may be familiar, because in liberation photographs, as I said, the faces are and bodies of the corpses are kind of grotesquely contorted and unrecognizable, amplifying what is to be the message of unspeakable horror. But there are some exceptions, and I'm not going to show the entire photograph, but you can't quite see it. It's a well-known image from Bergen-Belsen, some of you may have seen. And I remember how shocked I was when I saw it on the wall of the Holocaust Museum when I was first there, maybe 20 years ago. You will no longer see these images on the walls. So again, we are becoming much more aware of the impact of these photographs. So these are just details. You'll be able to access these kind of fragments of that photograph if you go on the museum's website, but not the photograph. Again, in the original photograph, the woman is naked, prominently on display, and the children sort of lying next to her is known as the mother and child image from Bergen-Belsen. I will maybe quote from art historian Barbie Zelizer, who said that there is a reason why the woman had been cropped out of the photo, and that is because, Zelizer says, she was considered both too beautiful and perhaps erotic. Maybe I will also quickly evoke Holocaust scholar Mark Celisniak. He wrote a book, excellent book on Bergen-Belsen, and he was reflecting on these moral dilemmas that the liberators, and especially artists who were accompanying the liberating armies, had in which pictures to take and which perhaps they preferred to not capture. And the moment that particularly stood out for Alex Colville, whom I had the honor to meet several times, he was with the Canadian Army, and so he was telling me about that moment, as I'm trying to convey, was very memorable for him. He was present at the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, and at one point he saw this beautiful naked woman, he said, that was carried on a blanket. And then he didn't know if the woman was dead and alive, and he really wanted to paint her. But then he decided not to. He really struggled with this aesthetic impulse, and then decided that it would dishonor the woman if he were to paint her. So he made a different decision than Makarewicz. Okay? These are difficult decisions to make. So why Colville struggled with this impulse struggled to abide by this etiquette of respecting the dignity of the woman's. Oh my goodness, okay, it's getting late. I think I need to forgo my explanation. I want to talk about David Aller, but perhaps we can say more. I will move on, okay. So I'm going back to this photograph, and I want to juxtapose it with another one. This is again from Skede, and this is another image from Skede. And the negative is corrupted, but you can see, a body of an older woman, and her buttocks are really central in that photograph. And she's wearing a girdle. If you look closer, you can almost hear the roars of laughter, of the German photographer who was taking the picture. So I was reminded of that image when I come across a set of two photographs in the album Zagłada Żydowstwa Polskiego, okay? Also of an older woman. And she's looking directly at the photographer, and in the other one, she's walking away. And her sweater is torn almost deliberately. Both of her breasts are protruding, okay? And this is an album, but you have a photograph of a German soldier. This is probably totally a coincidence, but it seems as if the woman were in his field of vision. And again, to me, it's, I can almost hear the roars of laughter of the German photographer who was taking these pictures. So I find it really instructive to juxtapose those two images, Makarewicz's and this one. I was looking for this photograph. I've been looking for it for a long time in Auschwitz-Birkenau and elsewhere. And I kind of know it's, at the moment, these images can be found in Getty's images. Well, good luck to me, millions of photographs. They disappeared. I have never seen them again, okay? Unlike the photographs who have become iconic. Różewicz would have not picked out this picture to put on the inside cover of his book. So as theorist Judith Butler has argued, you know, some areas of experience that don't fit into socially accepted frames simply disappear. And these are lives who, as Butler says, are ungrievable lives, lives that will never have been lived, sustained by no regard, no testimony, and ungrieved when lost. So maybe I will move toward my conclusion. Quote again from Mariana Hirsch and Leo Spitzer. They wrote a book, School Pictures in Liquid Times, and they say that these images, you know, they never stagnate into a fixed framework. They remain dynamic. They are unfixed. We can look at them differently. So here, Marta, do I have, how many minutes do I have? I should conclude, right? 5 minutes, okay. Because having juxtaposed all these images, reflected on them, and again with the Makarewicz photograph, I've been thinking about this picture for almost 20 years. I just wanted to quickly return to my encounter with the photograph in Różewicz's book. And now that I kind of think back, perhaps it was not a coincidence that Różewicz wrote that book of poem shortly after he wrote a book that was dedicated to his mother. It was entitled Matka odchodzi, Mother Departs. And there are no references in this book to his mother's Jewish descent, Jewish upbringing. And as I said, he didn't want me to disclose it in my encyclopedia entry, but many years later, he actually gave permission to the translators of that book to include it in the preface. So his mother escaped from home before an arranged marriage, found shelter at a parish where she was baptized, and she remained devoutly Catholic. So this is a photograph on the inside cover of Matka odchodzi. It's a picture of an older Stefania Różewicz, née Gelbert. And throughout the book, there is this refrain, mother's eyes rest on me. Like almost on every page, mother's eyes rest on me. Stefania Różewicz died after a long illness in 1957. Różewicz was at her side. The book is a kind of chronicle of him taking care of her. And the last line of the book is this affirmation of the mother's beauty and love. He writes, whatever was dearest and most beautiful in our home was mother. So now that I'm thinking about these photographs, I'm kind of looking at the beautiful dead woman that he chose, that Różewicz chose differently, that perhaps she was inhabited by another memory, by the memory of Różewicz's mother. The woman, if you remember, her kind of dark hair and dark eyes, either she decidedly was Jewish, or at least in Poland, that would have been that would have been synonymous with Jewishness anyway. And maybe Różewicz's agitation at my mention of his mother's Jewishness was kind of tapped into another memory, like the fear of the mother's alternative fate, her death in Auschwitz, had it been known that she was Jewish. And then Różewicz recalls his mother's final words, which were, take me, mommy. She reached out her hands, not me. So again, Stefania seems to, you know, return to her mother, like her Jewish mother. But Stefania Różewicz in 1945 would have been more than 50 years old. So in a way, it brings to mind the image of the other woman from Auschwitz, the tortured Jewess, where, you know, in Auschwitz, where thousands of Polish Jewish women were murdered. I know I should conclude, so I will just wrap it up. And what I'm trying to say is to sort of reconfigure these photographs so we can look at them differently. And what I want to say is that there is a way to look at these photographs that grant these photographs what I'd like to call testimonial agency. And again, in light of this gesture by Różewicz and Makarewicz of like evoking this Western ideal of female beauty, perhaps against that impulse, we can reverse the trajectory of the gaze. We can grant, the power of the dead woman to address the viewer. Maybe it is the axis of the dead woman's gaze that was first animated by the click of the camera that breaks through these symbolic and ideological constraints that had inframed her body. And beneath this illuminated surface of Makarewicz's photograph, the woman's beauty remains impenetrable to my eye, and it disturbs these accustomed ways of seeing. I wanted to say a little bit more, but I will wrap up. I'm drawing on ethical philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas, my favorite philosopher, who talks about the eye that listens. And he says, Emmanuel Levinas, ethical philosopher par excellence, who says that the life of another is more important than my life. And talking about the ways we look, he says that the temporality of the other resounds for the eye that listens. So I want to draw attention to this phrase, the listening eye, like my listening eye with which I look at this photograph. So the eye that listens, I believe, grants the agency to the gaze of the woman in this iconic image. And I think it grants agency to these unseeing eyes of the woman in Makarewicz's photograph. But in this forgotten image, entirely forgotten image of the massacred Jewess from Auschwitz, she's also looking directly at the viewers. And I think that gaze shatters the frame that displayed her as this dehumanizing, humiliating spectacle. And her eyes, to me, deliver a powerful message. So I'd like the last word to belong to her. Thank you. Oh,
Thank
no,
you
I
so
didn't
much.
want to show this. Okay. I'm sorry.
So now we'll take questions, and for those on Zoom, please ask your questions using the Q&A feature, and time allowing, my colleague Maya will ask some of those, but first we'll open it up to people in the room.
The question was first, and then I will move. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was struck by you described I try to pronounce Makarewicz's photos there as part of that one photo is part of a sequence, and I suppose, I mean, it's a little, I don't know, obvious, but the first thing that I thought of in terms of the photographs of naked women in Auschwitz as part of a sequence were, of course, the Sonderkommando photographs, which obviously have a very different,
What
the
photograph?
Sonderkommando,
Oh.
which obviously,
Thank you for that.
right, have a
Absolutely.
very different context, but the objects, like, in a certain sense, are the same, which provides an interesting point of, I guess, contrast in between this liberator photograph versus a prisoner photograph. So I was wondering if maybe you had any thoughts about their difference and what perhaps the less professional Sonderkommando photographs in fact give us, or that it also is a somewhat problematic capturing of naked women as well.
Thank you for that. Perhaps instead of trying to speculate, I will quote from a well-known historian, Janina Struk. And if you are interested in Holocaust photography, her book on Holocaust photography is perhaps like the seminal work. And she actually talks about this particular photograph. Do we know the Sonderkommando? There are 4 well-known images, and one of them shows, again, fully undressed women running through the forest. You can see the trees on the way to the gas chamber. They were clandestine photographs. And also the ones that we know that the image is cropped, right? Because the trees were like most prominent. But the ones we see in museums are kind of close-up of women. And I think the things I've said were horrific enough, but I will say that. Usually the images that you see that are reproduced and you look close at them, which I did, and that Strzok pays attention to, I looked at them in the Holocaust Museum and actually even pointed it out to the person who takes care of the collection. The facial features, the breasts and the pubis are retouched. Retouched. I'm sorry to say that, okay?
In the Sonderkommando.
Yes, yes. So not in the original, not on the negative, but the way that they were later reproduced, they are often retouched to enhance facial features and breasts, okay? So again, I cannot, just comment on how different they are, but that photograph, fine. Makarewicz was not an amateur photographer. That was a very carefully composed photograph. The Sonderkommando photograph is now being sort of lifted. It's horrific,
Right.
but it is also being aestheticized, okay, to sort of capture the images of these women. And now I just actually remember that I came across that Sonderkommando photograph in an album by, his last name is Leszczyński, 1990-some. It was an album of the most memorable 100 Polish photographs. And they were like different photographs, among which this one was one. And it wasn't even a Polish photograph, like the photographer wasn't Polish, but it was included in this album. So again, this kind of, I think, bears the truth, of this argument that these kind of aestheticized tropes, right, that are so prevalent in Western iconography appear in these images. And this is, I'm not, yes, it is outrageous, but I think there is more to it, okay? You can also think, if I can just quickly say that, Makarewicz, why would he do that? Possibly also, and again, I'm thinking of art historian Griselda Pollock, who makes this argument. She says because this image of Eros Thanatos, perhaps it also has this effect of, and it has this kind of function of buffering this encounter with death, right? Like a kind of warding off this horrible sight of the Gorgon, as Primo Levi said. Right? This kind of has an apotropaic function of sort of warding off like the most horrible. Okay? So again, we can look even at that kind of moment of aestheticization in different ways. That was a long answer, sorry. I know that you had a question.
I just was wondering, I was so taken aback by the captions. And I wondered if you ever came across any interviews with him, or if he ever spoke about the impact of those photographs. It seemed that maybe his family still is connected to those photographs since they were loaned to USC.
Thank you very much. Again, I've been looking for this photograph. I was looking for quite a while. Maybe one thing, this is somewhat speculative, but the soldiers and photographers of the Soviet and Polish army, they would have been accustomed already to these sites of horror to a degree, the way that perhaps, American and British soldiers were not. So if I'm thinking of Alex Colville, who shared with me how absolutely horrific that was and unbearable, stayed with him. He wanted to tell everyone of what it was to be in Bergen-Belsen. So again, that kind of shock may have been a little lesser, perhaps, for the Polish soldiers. Makarewicz previously had already been in Majdanek. Hey, the liberation of Majdanek, where he must have seen these horrors already. That's one. But again, regarding the impact, I actually, thanks to Janina Struk, I managed to find Makarevich's son and interview him. It was a long interview. I talked to him for 2 hours, and I really wanted to know what camera. It was Exacta Varex. I wanted to know everything, what film, and also how his father talked about these photographs. The negatives were lost. So the son, Stanisław Makarewicz, only has the original prints, and they are in his possession. So to me, and after the war, Makarewicz was a very successful photographer artist, like numerous awards, including in Paris, etc. And this is a beautiful photograph for all intents and purposes, but admittedly, it had never been included in his kind of portfolio. Okay? So this image, and that's what the son assured me of. He said, it was never included in any art exhibits. There are Holocaust photographs that have become like iconic art photographs, like Bartelmann's Grief. I don't know if you know, right? It's like, an art objects, right? But this one was only shown in the context of memorialization, okay? Admittedly, right? Not as an art photograph. So Makarewicz was very mindful of that. That's what I'm trying to say, to sort of separate out these photographs from Auschwitz from his artistic portfolio, okay? Nevertheless, and there goes, the argument I was trying to make. Who was first? Oh, I have 3 questions. Maybe in this order, I believe, to be fair. I think, yes, that's where I saw.
Thank you so much for this talk. It's given me a lot to think about within my own work, and how to, especially the giving back of the dignity and humanity. And something that was really touched on as you were talking is the pulling from the Susan Sontag of the beautiful cadaver, and like thinking about that, and thinking about this reinforcement of the certain boundaries, and how that one woman from Auschwitz, in that photo book, that photograph is not remembered or recalled. And so I guess just thinking further of like where you see Holocaust photography kind of moving forward and trying to push back against those traditional gender norms, while also being mindful and respectful of the circumstances in which these photographs were being produced, which you did throughout the presentation.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I don't think I'm in the position, it really would be hubris on my part if I could, advise photographers, because this is definitely not my area. What I can do personally as a teacher, as a researcher, is to try and think of ways of looking at those photographs, and to sort of, push through these kind of frameworks of meaning that frame, the bodies of these women. And again, I'm drawing on Judith Butler, if some of you know Butler's work, to kind of, Butler says frame the frame or shift the frame. And Butler gives the example of photographs from Abu Ghraib, who were also taken to humiliate the inmates. But when they broke out of prison, they really changed a lot, right? They caused outrage. And really shifted the discourse. So that's why it is not a metaphor to say that these photographs do have agency, right? That dead bodies do have agency, that they are subjects, not objects, right? And that's perhaps how we should look at them, how we should engage with them, not look with them. Just it's a relation that we have with these images that I think we can reconfigure. So that's what I can do. And the rest, the photographers, hopefully, it's part of the discourse. Thank you. You both had the question, and then Maya had the question.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dorota. So I was thinking about your kind of sentence about giving back or giving agency to these bodies and these women, and in different parts of the talk, cropping had kind of played a very important role. And since we work more with kind of photographs as primary sources now, rather than just using them as illustrations. I have to admit, I also use cropping, but I thought I used cropping to give actually agency to the protagonist in my photographs. But now I realize that cropping can actually taking away the agency, because when you think about the cropping and what you mentioned, the Sonderkommando, that the actual surrounding is actually dominant, and the women are kind of very tiny and small, and when you crop them and put them on the forefront, actually taking away what kind of the placement in their surroundings is. It speaks to the absences also, or the silences, which when we crop out, who is witnessing actually these people, who is participating in this. And I mean nature, but also humans. And so I wonder if we need to rethink what we do with photographs regarding cropping, and if cropping is not really a way to take away agency, rather to give it to them. Yeah, so.
Thank you. In a way, you
can I just add one thing? Sorry, because I also saw when you showed this the different ways how people use this photograph, which is the central photograph. There was this one in the book where actually the cropping was like shifted in a way, so it was not central anymore. So it created a more distant look at the woman. So even the way how you edit the photo, not just the cropping, but also the editing can actually change the perspective.
Right, or like the sepia color, right? You can kind of infuse it, or like I faded, the photograph in my cover image. I manipulated it as well. So again, I don't think I have an answer, and I say you kind of caught me. You don't even though you don't know, but my final image, I actually cropped the eyes. Like of all the photographs I'm showing, I just cropped the eyes, like the faces, and that's what I wanted to show. And there's like, maybe I shouldn't. So I changed that, and then I cropped it again, and then I changed it, and I couldn't decide, right? Because I thought I want to convey the message of like the power of like the message of the eyes, but then I'm just like really distorting the photograph. I think what's important is to, how to put it, situate ourselves, to draw attention to our own manipulation of the photo, or even to our affective responses to the photo, to sort of hold ourselves, responsible for what we as viewers and teachers do with those photos. And that's, I think, a kind of honest thing to do, right? What we owe those photos, so to say, and people in the images. So, I don't have a definitive answer whether, cropping is good or not, but to expose these conventions and these gestures is important. Just very quickly, there is one very, very well-known photo of, from, is it Ivanograd? I'm forgetting, I think it's from Ivanograd, is of a German soldier shooting at a woman with a child. Okay, very well known, and it is always shown as cropped, because to me that really highlights, it's obvious, it highlights this mother-child, suffering mother imagery, but the photograph is much larger, okay? So again, it kind of conveys a trope, right? And it's important, I think, to unpack that kind of manipulation. Thank you. I think we had a question, Maya, and then
yes. So
Vasim.
I'm asking the questions for the Zoom room. There are a lot of really wonderful questions. There's already, I think you've already kind of touched upon some of what people have already been asking about. I think in terms of like, some people were asking about, and you answered like what it means for a photograph to speak back to us, what it means for like a dead person to speak back. So you've touched on that as well. I know that you were just talking about what it means, how we manipulate photos and what you show. Alex Robichaud was also saying that I can tell that you put a lot of care and thoughts into deciding which photos to show and not show. And I appreciate the content warnings and continual acknowledgement of the very difficult nature of viewing these. And so has kind of a question that ties into what was just discussed about the cropping of how do you approach deciding which of these to show and not to show and to talk about? And like, are there any alternative methods that you know of to evoke these photos without actually showing them?
Thank you. And I know that some teachers and scholars choose not to show any photographs or to write an article about photographs without showing them and describing them very carefully. And I really respect that. I also know I kind of agonize over every photo I show. And then I decided in this particular circumstance and context to share these images. I think for myself and in the classroom, it also depends, you know, there are images I wouldn't show to my undergraduate students, but I show them, especially in my like graduate class on gender and genocide. I can provide context. So for me, it is very important to provide the context, explain the provenance of the photograph, try to learn about it as much as I can rather than just sort of show it as an illustration. And even this kind of loving care that I extend to that photograph, I think that's what needs to be sort of provided in the context before I can show that image. So I think, and I do believe, for me, I think it's important to share these images because, you know, to me they are proof of existence. Okay? And the fact that we find images of naked women taboo, but perhaps not of naked men, but, you know, that's the topic of another lecture maybe. That just again speaks to certain social conventions, and it's high time, you know, we challenge them and broke, you know, through the constraints of those conventions. So I want to do that too. So I hope there's a lot that can be actually achieved, but they have to be shown, as I said. And I really hope, you know, I have done that, and I apologize if I didn't, but it has to be done compassionately. It has to be done respectfully. Okay? Thank
Maybe
you.
one final question.
So throughout your presentation, you focused mainly on showing that how cropping and showing these women really objectifies and also sexualizes the women and romanticizes the Holocaust in a way. Do you think that also partly the intention of the photographer could have been to, because in our culture, for arguably good reasons, it is more demonized to kill women and children than it is to kill men. And by showing them naked, you highlight their how defenseless they are even more. And so do you think the intention of these photos might also partly have been to highlight the cruelty of the Nazis even more?
Absolutely. Okay. So again, it really depends. But if you read like Barbie Zelizer and Janina Strok and some other just like interpretations of Holocaust photographs, you will a body of a naked woman and child. Okay, these are like symbols of utter vulnerability and also passivity. Okay, the fact that women are considered to be passive, etc., etc. I recommend Sigmund Freud's essay on femininity, where he like lies it out: female passivity, activity, and so forth. So again, these are all kind of social, as I said, frameworks of meaning, right? That would cause us to believe that these vulnerable women's bodies would then be emblematic of like the horror and utter evil of what transpired. Absolutely. So that absolutely, this is also why these images have become so emblematic, right? Or images of children, as I said, the boy from the Warsaw Ghetto, right? And children in the ghetto of Litzmannstadt Łódź being, deported to Chełmno. And so by all means, these are images of vulnerability. However, I don't think we can, I wish I had time to talk about Oler. I don't know if you saw that glimpse. I took that picture 2 weeks ago at the Ronald Reagan Library. If you have time, please see the exhibit. Auschwitz, not so long ago, not far away. There is a section on the Sonderkommando. I don't know if you're familiar, David Oler was a member of the Sonderkommando and a prominent artist. And there are images of like the work drawings of the Sonderkommando, like dragging these bodies, and they are all beautiful, full, some big-breasted women, which is not what the bodies that the Sonderkommando worked with looked like, okay? So again, Oler is trying to convey the horror of what the Sonderkommando did, and women's bodies are emblematic of it. But then these conventions are like persistent even in these most horrific, what can be more horrific than the work of the Sonderkommando, as Primo Levi wrote, right? So we cannot, and there is nothing in the museum, in the Reagan Library that says, maybe it's problematic, maybe these images shouldn't be on the wall. I was upset that I like walk in, what do I see? These like, you know, totally decontextualized, and here is what Sonderkommando's work looked like. No reflection on those prevalent tropes. That I find objectionable. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dorota.
Thank you very much. Thank you.